You ever notice how the mind whispers things to you long before you give yourself permission to listen? How it paints entire worlds in the quiet between your breaths, shaping your sense of who you are even when you're too distracted to notice. I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you're standing at the edge of a still lake at dawn, the water untouched, the sky holding its breath, and as you gaze into the soft reflection staring back, you realize you've spent most of your life confusing the ripples for the lake, the noise for the truth, the passing thoughts for the person you were supposed to become. There is a question, ancient and persistent, that rises in you like a tide. Why does fear feel so instinctive, while confidence feels like something you have to earn? And you wonder, quietly, if maybe the difference isn't real at all. If maybe your mind learns confidence the same way it learns fear, piece by piece, repetition by repetition, through the stories you whisper to yourself in the dark. But this realization carries a paradox, a quiet tension. If your mind is shaped by what you practice, then how much of your life has been shaped by things you never consciously chose? And how much could change if you learn to choose differently? This question lingers like a soft hum beneath the surface as we drift into the subtle illusion, the everyday dream you walk through without realizing you're asleep. Because the truth is, most people don't know they're living inside a story until something shakes the pages. And so we move into the soft glow of everyday life, where the world feels familiar and harmless, but quietly molds you when you're not paying attention. Picture yourself at a social gathering, a living room filled with warm lighting, laughter spilling over half-empty glasses, people exchanging stories they've already told a dozen times. On the surface, it looks like connection, like belonging, like something steady and warm. But look closer. Really look, and you'll notice the micro-expressions, the subtle reflexes, the way people carefully assemble themselves, like actors stepping on stage. You'll notice how someone speaks a little too lightly because they don't want to appear needy, or how someone else laughs a little too loudly because the silence underneath their skin terrifies them. You'll notice how a simple question, "How have you been?" becomes a performance, and how you, too, participate in this silent ritual, offering polished fragments instead of truth. And without realizing it, you absorb these patterns, these invisible rules, until confidence becomes something you imitate rather than inhabit. You learn to hold your shoulders a little straighter, not because you feel certain, but because you've learned the choreography of seeming okay. And quietly, your mind takes notes. It watches you withdraw when you're afraid. It watches you stay silent when you want to speak. It watches you hesitate, flinch, shrink. And because the mind is obedient, almost too obedient, it learns, this is who we are. Not because it's true, but because it's practiced. Then picture yourself at work, moving through another routine day. The soft blue glow of your screen, the hum of air conditioning, the polite small talk that fills the hallway like static. You know how to function here. You know the rules. You know when to nod, when to stay quiet, when to hide the spark of an idea because the risk feels heavier than the potential reward. And your mind watches this too. Every time you stay silent to avoid embarrassment, every time you doubt your own instincts, every time you defer to someone else, even though you knew the answer all along, your mind learns fear. Not dramatic fear, not panic, not anxiety that announces itself loudly. No, the quiet kind. The kind that slips in disguised as being reasonable. The kind that settles under your skin until hesitation becomes your default. And the mind, ever loyal, continues recording. At home, the illusion deepens. Maybe you sit at the dinner table with family, listening to the gentle rhythm of voices that have shaped you since childhood. Maybe you hear echoes of old lessons, old warnings, old doubts disguised as concern. Be careful. Don't get your hopes up. Don't make things harder for yourself. Just be grateful for what you already have. And your mind absorbs this too, soaking it in until fear becomes familiar, logical, almost comforting because it feels like home. And without realizing it, your sense of possibility begins to shrink to the size of your surroundings. Not because you lack potential, but because your environment has taught you to dim it. But here is the quiet punchline. The subtle twist beneath the surface. You learned all of this, which means it can be unlearned, which means confidence is not a force that some people are born with and others are not. It is simply another pattern, another story, another skill your mind picks up through repetition. Just like fear, just like doubt, just like every belief you've carried without ever examining its origin. And yet, because the illusion is so easy to live inside, most people never wake up enough to realize they are not bound by it. And as you move through your life, through small conversations, through passing glances, through the quiet choices that shape your days, you might not notice how often you internalize the invisible lessons of your environment. You might not notice the heaviness you carry is not your fault. It's simply conditioning. But once you start to notice, even faintly, something shifts. A thin crack appears in the wall of the everyday illusion. A whisper rises within you. If my mind can learn fear simply by exposure, then what else could it learn with intention? And this question, simple and dangerous, begins the awakening. And so the illusion stretches on, quietly shaping the edges of your identity, teaching you to move through the world as though life is something happening to you rather than something you're co-creating. You feel it, especially in the small moments, the times you want to speak up but talk yourself out of it, the times you want to take a risk but feel the gravity of everyone else's expectations holding you in place, the times you feel a spark of clarity inside you but dismiss it because it wasn't validated by the people around you. You become like a river, learning the shape of its container, adapting to the structure it's been poured into, forgetting that it was once powerful enough to carve through stone. And this is the quiet tragedy of the everyday illusion. Not that it exists, but that we forget it exists. That we learn to navigate it so well, we stop questioning whether it's real. Most people spend decades living inside these unspoken rules, believing their limitations are personal rather than inherited, believing their fears are evidence rather than echoes. But the truth waits beneath all this calm, patient, unchanging like a lighthouse trying to guide you back to yourself. And that truth becomes visible only when you pause long enough to see the patterns you've been repeating without intention. Something subtle changes when you start asking, where did I learn this? Who taught me to doubt myself? Why do I shrink when my soul wants to expand? These questions, once whispered, begin to unravel the illusion, thread by thread, until the fabric of your automatic life starts to loosen. And this leads you into the moment of awakening, a moment that rarely announces itself with fireworks or grand revelations. Often, it's quiet, almost imperceptible. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary day, maybe while you're washing dishes, or driving home, or lying awake in the soft glow of your bedroom ceiling. And suddenly, the truth slides into your awareness, like a warm blade of light. Your mind has been learning from everything you repeat. It has memorized your fears not because they're powerful, but because they're familiar. It has internalized your doubts not because they're true, but because they've been practiced. And in this instant, you realize something that feels both liberating and terrifying. If you can learn fear so effortlessly, then confidence isn't a mystery. It's a skill. A skill you never practiced because you didn't know you could. This realization hits you with a subtle emotional force, the kind that doesn't shatter you, but rearranges you. You feel a tug at your chest, a kind of inner shiver, like your soul is waking from a long sleep. You realize how many of your limitations were inherited, how many of your insecurities were taught, and how many of your beliefs were simply borrowed shadows you mistook for your own. You see how often you predicted rejection before it happened, how often you assumed failure before trying, how often you silenced yourself because someone long ago suggested you should. And suddenly it all becomes clear. These patterns were never you. They were simply grooves your mind carved over time, grooves you can choose to stop following. But awakening is not gentle. It carries a subtle danger, a quiet tension, because once you see the truth, you can no longer unsee it. Once you realize how deeply conditioned your fear is, you start noticing every hesitation, every apology you never owed, every place in your life where you've been dimming your own light. And this noticing can feel like standing in a room filled with mirrors, forced to confront every angle of yourself. The parts you've ignored, the parts you've denied, the parts you've inherited without question. The world you once moved through automatically begins to look different, almost unfamiliar. People's words reveal hidden meanings. Conversations reveal unspoken insecurities. Situations you once shrugged off suddenly expose their deeper, emotional layers. It's as though someone turned up the brightness on reality, and now you can see everything. And this heightened awareness brings with it a weight, because now you see not only your own fear patterns, but everyone else's too. You notice how people shrink when they are scared, how they overcompensate when they feel insecure, how they avoid vulnerability, how they protect themselves through silence, sarcasm, control, or intellectual distance. You start seeing the outlines of their conditioning, the invisible rules dictating their behavior, and part of you wants to reach out, to shake them gently awake, to show them the truth you've discovered. But another part of you hesitates, sensing the complexity of awakening. Because awakening is not a gift you can give someone, it's a journey they must stumble into on their own. Still, the moment of realization, this subtle cracking open, marks the beginning of everything. It's the moment your mind stops being a passive recorder and begins to question its own programming. You feel this shift like a spark beneath the ribs, a sense that you've stepped into a deeper dimension of existence. And with that spark comes a revelation so simple, it almost feels absurd. If your mind can learn fear through repetition, then it can learn confidence the same way. If it can memorize doubt through familiarity, then it can memorize courage through practice. If it can be shaped unconsciously, then it can also be shaped consciously. And suddenly, you're no longer trapped. Suddenly, the walls you thought were real reveal themselves as impressions. Suddenly, the limitations you carried for years feel like illusions melting under the warmth of awareness. This awakening is not yet transformation. It is simply the opening of the door, the moment you realize you were never locked inside. But as with any truth that reshapes your world, it carries a cost. Awakening often pulls you away from the comfort of the product, familiar. It makes you aware of how many people around you are still asleep, still trapped in their conditioning, still living the illusions you've begun to see through. And that awareness brings you into the next stage of the journey, one that is quieter but heavier, one that most people don't talk about, the stage where you begin to feel profoundly, unexpectedly alone. And so the awakening, beautiful as it is, brings with it an unexpected coldness, the kind that settles in the spaces between you and the world, the kind that makes you feel as though you've stepped behind a curtain that most people never notice is there. You begin to see how differently you now move through conversations, how the words people speak no longer sit comfortably on the surface, but reveal tremors beneath them. Fear disguised as certainty, insecurity disguised as confidence, longing disguised as indifference. You start hearing the tension in someone's laughter, sensing the ache behind someone's anger, feeling the emptiness in someone's bragging. It's as if reality has shifted into higher resolution, allowing you to perceive nuances and motives and emotions that once floated invisibly through your life. And at first, this clarity feels like a gift, a secret language only you can interpret. But soon, a heaviness settles in, because seeing deeply often means feeling deeply. And feeling deeply often means carrying the things others refuse to acknowledge within themselves. You notice the isolation most when you're surrounded by people. You might be sitting at a table with friends, listening to the familiar rhythm of conversation, watching their hands gesture and their faces animate as they reenact small stories from the week. But underneath it all, you feel as though you're watching from another dimension, witnessing the choreography of their defenses, the subtle flinches of their insecurities, the ways they carefully avoid the truths that would unravel them if spoken aloud. And there's a strange loneliness in that awareness, a sense that you've wandered someplace others don't know how to reach. You feel like a lighthouse standing in the middle of a storm, casting light into the darkness, while the ships below drift unaware of the rocks beneath them. They laugh, they talk, they live on the surface beautifully, innocently. and you sit quietly with the knowledge that the surface is the thinnest part of who any of us truly are. The isolation grows more profound when you try to share your insight. You might attempt to express what you've noticed, to articulate the deeper patterns you see. But the moment the words leave your mouth, you realize they don't land. Not really. People tilt their heads, nod politely, maybe even agree in principle, but they don't feel what you feel. They don't hear the weight behind your words. They don't sense the depth of the awareness you're trying to express, and so you retreat, not because you want to hide, but because you learn again the ancient truth. Not everyone is ready to see themselves clearly, and not everyone wants to. And so you begin to walk a quieter path. You stop trying to explain the depths you perceive. You stop trying to wake others before they're ready. You stop offering truths that leave you feeling more alone when they're misunderstood. You begin to realize that insight, while beautiful, can become a burden when no one around you shares its weight. And in this realization, you feel a subtle grief, a mourning for the simplicity you lost, for the innocence that evaporated the moment your awareness expanded beyond the comfortable illusions of everyday life. And yet, within the loneliness, something strangely grounding appears. You start to value silence in a new way. You learn to appreciate the moments when the world feels still, when the noise of expectation fades, when you can hear the faint hum of your own being. You notice how few people allow themselves to sit in stillness, how quickly they reach for distractions, phones, conversations, tasks to avoid facing themselves. You watch this with a softness, not judgment, but with the sad understanding of someone who once lived that way too. And in this softness, the isolation becomes less of a punishment and more of a rite of passage, an emotional threshold that every conscious person crosses eventually. But the cost remains. You feel it in the way you sometimes hesitate before speaking, careful not to reveal too much. You feel it in the way you hold back parts of your inner world, not out of secrecy, but out of self-protection. You feel it in the way relationships shift subtly, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because you're no longer able to participate in the unconscious games people play. You don't want to pretend. You don't want to perform. You don't want to filter yourself into palatable pieces to make others comfortable. And this authenticity, while freeing, separates you from the world that once felt familiar. This separation reaches its peak when you encounter someone who mirrors your depth, someone who sees through the surface too. But such encounters are rare, and when they happen, they're often fleeting, like two passing comets catching sight of one another before vanishing back into the vastness of the night. And this rarity deepens the loneliness, making you aware of how few people truly understand the terrain you've stepped into. Yet this isolation is not the end. It's the threshold of the next stage, where awareness doesn't just illuminate your loneliness, it begins to ignite conflict within you. Because once you see deeply, you're faced with a difficult question. What do you do with what you see? Do you speak the truth and risk breaking the fragile peace around you? Do you stay silent and suffocate beneath the weight of your own insights? Do you step in when you sense someone is harming themselves, emotionally, even if they can't see it? Or do you step back and watch the people you care about repeat the same painful patterns again and again because they're not ready to confront them? And this is where the conflict begins, inside you, quietly but fiercely. You feel torn between compassion and boundaries, between honesty and gentleness, between involvement and detachment. You want to help, but you no longer believe in saving people. You want to speak, but you no longer want to create unnecessary suffering. You want to honor your depth, but you also want to remain connected to others. And trying to balance these opposing truths can feel like walking a tightrope stretched between your heart and your integrity. The conflict deepens when you realize that seeing clearly often means seeing pain before others feel it. You notice the moment someone begins withdrawing, long before they admit they're struggling. You sense when a friend is lying to themselves, even if they believe the lie wholeheartedly. You see the patterns repeating before they unfold, and knowing too much feels like holding a storm in your hands, powerful, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. This is the beginning of the internal struggle that shapes the next part of your journey. the place where awareness transforms into responsibility, and responsibility transforms into emotional weight. And so the conflict within you keeps tightening, like a thread pulled slowly through the fabric of your life, pulling you between two equally honest truths: the desire to protect others from their own unconscious patterns, and the understanding that every person must walk the path of their own becoming, at their own pace, in their own time. You feel this most intensely with the people you love. You watch them make choices that bruise them emotionally, choices you can see unraveling long before they see the threads begin to fray. You listen as they vent about the same struggles they refuse to change, repeating the same narratives, reenacting the same wounds, circling the same emotional terrain. You want to guide them gently, to hold a mirror before their heart so they can see what you see. But the moment you try, something inside you hesitates. Because you know perhaps better than ever that truth offered too early is not healing, it is violence. And truth offered too late is regret. And you live suspended between these two extremes, unsure which choice is kinder. So you speak carefully, walking the fragile line between honesty and compassion, aware that every word carries the potential to liberate or destabilize. And at times, you say nothing, choosing silence not out of apathy but out of respect for their journey, holding your insight like a delicate flame you dare not expose to wind. But this silence takes its own toll. You feel the weight of the truth you're carrying, the pressure of the perspective you can't share fully. It sits inside you like a stone warmed by sunlight, heavy yet glowing, a stillness the world around you doesn't know how to hold. You carry the burden of seeing too much, of feeling too much, of understanding too deeply. And there is a private sorrow in knowing that your awareness, this gift, this clarity, this depth, can also isolate you from the very people you love most. It is here, in this tension, that the conflict inside you begins to swell into something larger, something heavier, something that threatens to consume the quiet corners of your mind. You start to wonder if awareness is a blessing or a curse, if clarity is illumination or simply a brighter view of the chaos. You feel your internal compass spinning, searching for direction, for grounding, for a sense of certainty you can rest inside. But every answer leads to another question, and every insight leads to another layer of the labyrinth. This is where the conflict turns inward, where the struggle stops being about others and starts being about you, your identity, your purpose, your emotional boundaries, your sense of belonging. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the conflict begins to wear you down. This erosion leads you into the next stage, the collapse, the moment where the weight of your awareness, your empathy, your emotional attunement becomes too much to hold without consequence. It often begins with fatigue, not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that seeps into your soul, the exhaustion of being too attuned, too perceptive, too responsible for emotional landscapes you never intended to navigate. You start feeling heavy in conversations that once felt effortless. You speak less because your mind is analyzing every layer of every moment. You listen more deeply than anyone realizes, absorbing every unspoken tension, every subtle fear, every emotional ripple until your inner world becomes crowded with echoes that aren't your own. And slowly, your sense of self begins to blur at the edges, your emotional boundaries dissolving under the constant influx of signals and sensations. You might notice yourself becoming overstimulated by things that used to feel normal. Small talk drains you, crowded spaces overwhelm you, emotional confessions leave you exhausted rather than connected. You begin losing the ability to distinguish between your feelings and the feelings of others. Someone's sadness becomes your sadness. Someone's anxiety becomes your tension. Someone's disappointment sticks to you like a film you can't wash off. And though no one around you can see the weight you're carrying, you feel it pressing against your chest, making every breath feel slightly heavier than the last. You start waking up tired, going to bed wired, your mind looping through scenarios and reflections long after the world has gone quiet. And this inner spiral intensifies as you begin to realize that seeing deeply does not just illuminate the world, it exposes you to its emotional undercurrents in Kessin. ways your nervous system was never taught to handle. Soon, the collapse becomes physical. Your shoulders stay tense, your stomach tightens, your thoughts race. Your sleep fractures into restless fragments. You feel wired and drained at the same time, as though your mind is sprinting while your body is sinking. You may even begin to feel detached from your own life, watching yourself go through motions, respond to conversations, perform tasks, while somewhere inside you there's a quiet numbness, a sense of floating just above your own existence. This dissociation, subtle at first, begins to spread through your days like a fog, and you begin to wonder if anything is wrong with you, or if this is simply the cost of seeing too much. But the collapse is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a soft unraveling. You find yourself crying for reasons you can't articulate. You find yourself withdrawing from people you love, not because you don't care, but because you care too much. You find yourself craving silence so deeply it feels like a hunger in your bones. You find yourself yearning for a version of yourself that existed before the awakening, before the awareness, before the emotional heaviness that now fills your internal space. It's not that you want to go backward. Part of you knows you can't. It's that you miss the simplicity of not feeling so much, not thinking so deeply, not carrying emotional truths that no one around you notices. In this collapse, you may begin to resent your own sensitivity, your insight, your ability to perceive what others overlook. You may feel broken, overwhelmed, fragmented like a mirror cracked by its own reflections. And this is where the collapse reaches its deepest point. When you begin to question your worth, your role, your place in the world. You may wonder whether your awareness serves any purpose at all, or whether it simply makes life harder. You may feel lost in the labyrinth of your own understanding, unsure where to go, unsure what to do, unsure how to breathe without inhaling the emotions of everyone around you. This is the moment where you feel stripped down to your core, raw, vulnerable, exposed. And though it feels like the breaking point, it is not the end, it is the threshold of transformation. And yet, in the very heart of the collapse, when you feel most fragile, most uncertain, most overwhelmed, something quiet begins to form inside you, delicate but persistent, like a small light flickering at the bottom of a dark well. It doesn't announce itself with certainty or clarity. It arrives subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a soft breath against your spine. After all the breakdowns, all the emotional noise, all the weight you've carried, there comes a moment where your system becomes too exhausted to resist, too tired to cling, too worn down to keep wrestling with the world or yourself. And in that surrender, not a glamorous spiritual moment, but a quiet, shaky exhale, there is space. Space where something ancient and wise can finally reach you. It's the realization that you do not need to hold what is not yours. You do not need to solve what others refuse to face. You do not need to absorb emotions that do not belong to you. And you begin to see, with a clarity that feels both liberating and painful, that your suffering did not come from seeing too much. It came from believing you had to do something with everything you saw. This is the beginning of the revelation. Awareness is not a burden when paired with boundaries. Suddenly, the world inside you begins to reorganize. You start to understand that your mind learned fear through repetition, yes, but it also learned responsibility, absorption, hyperattunement, and self-sacrifice in the same way. You were conditioned to feel for everyone, but rarely taught to feel for yourself. You were taught to anticipate others' emotions, but not taught to honor your own. And so this revelation doesn't arrive as a new idea. It arrives as a remembering that you too are a person deserving of gentleness, a remembering that emotional responsibility is not the same as emotional ownership, a remembering that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. You begin to see how your depth can be a gift, not when it consumes you, but when it is expressed through choice rather than compulsion. You begin to realize that confidence, like fear, is not an identity, but a practice, one you can slowly teach your mind by choosing, again and again, to return to yourself. And as this truth settles into your bones, you feel something shift. The world still looks the same, but it doesn't feel the same. The emotional noise around you becomes less overwhelming, not because it's gone, but because you're no longer absorbing it unconsciously. You start to recognize the subtle difference between compassion and entanglement, between caring and caretaking, between listening and losing yourself. You begin to understand that it's not your job to fix anyone. It's your job to stay rooted, steady, and real. And in doing so, you paradoxically become a healthier presence in the lives of others, not because you carry them, but because you no longer crumble under the weight of their unspoken stories. You become witness instead of sponge. You become grounded instead of flooded. You become compassionate without becoming consumed. This revelation softens you, not into fragility, but into strength of a different kind. Strength that comes from clarity, boundaries, and presence. You feel it the first time you hear someone's pain and don't immediately take it into your chest. The first time you say no without guilt. The first time you take a step back, not out of withdrawal, but out of wisdom. The first time you choose rest over responsibility, silence over performance, authenticity over approval. And the more you practice this, the more your mind learns. Confidence is not a singular moment. It's a repetition, a muscle, a shaping of your internal world through choices you consistently make, especially when they're uncomfortable. And as your boundaries strengthen, something unexpected happens. The loneliness begins to fade, not because people become deeper or more aware, but because you stop expecting others to meet you where you are. You stop trying to translate your depth into something digestible. You stop apologizing for how you see the world. And in that acceptance, you find a quiet companionship with yourself, a presence that feels honest, steady, warm. You begin to enjoy your own company in a way you never could before, because your inner world is no longer a battlefield. It becomes a sanctuary. This inner peace doesn't arrive all at once. It grows slowly, like light gradually filling a room at dawn. You notice it first in the mornings, when you wake up and your mind feels slightly more spacious, slightly more steady. You feel it in conversations where you no longer rush to respond, but listen from a grounded place. You feel it when you sense someone's emotions, but keep your center intact. You feel it when you stop trying to manage everything, and instead allow life to move through you with less resistance. Slowly, piece by piece, the collapse transforms into rebuilding. And the rebuilding leads you gently into the final stage, integration. This is where the insights you've gained stop being ideas and begin becoming embodied truth. Integration is not dramatic. It feels more like learning to walk again after forgetting how your legs work. You start to apply your boundaries with love, not rigidity. You begin to trust your perceptions without drowning in them. You learn to step back from emotional entanglement without stepping away from connection. And you begin to hold confidence not as a performance but as a quiet, inner knowing one that remains steady even when fear taps at your door. You realize that confidence is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to not let fear be the teacher anymore. And as these truths root themselves inside you, you begin to feel something you haven't felt in a long time: ease. Not the numb kind, not the avoidant kind, but the deep, earned ease of someone who has walked through their own shadows and returned with a softer heart and a clearer mind. You feel a kind of reverence for your journey, for the collapse that broke you open, for the awakening that isolated you, for the conflict that challenged you, for the boundaries that saved you. And there, in the center of your life, you understand the paradox that began this entire journey. Your mind learned fear through repetition, but it also learned confidence the same way through every moment you return to yourself instead of abandoning your own truth. And so, as the journey settles into its final shape, you find yourself standing in a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of collapse, not the hush of loneliness, not the breathless pause of awakening, but the calm certainty of someone who has returned home to themselves. You begin to move through the world with a softness that is not weakness, but wisdom, the kind of softness that comes from knowing exactly where you end and where others begin. You carry your awareness like a lantern rather than a burden, illuminating your path without trying to force light into places where others aren't ready to look. You listen without absorbing. You empathize without dissolving. You care without carrying. You begin to speak from a deeper place, not to convince or control, but to express truth without attachment. And your mind, once trained so deeply in fear, in overthinking, in emotional entanglement, slowly begins to learn an entirely new rhythm. A rhythm of trust, a rhythm of grounded presence, a rhythm of quiet inner confidence that doesn't need to be seen to exist. You sense it in your posture, in your breathing, in the way you walk into rooms without shrinking, without anticipating judgment, without rehearsing who you need to be. You show up as yourself not because you're certain, but because certainty no longer defines your worth. And as you move through life with this newfound integration, you begin to notice something extraordinary. People respond differently. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped abandoning yourself. Your boundaries create respect. Your presence creates resonance. Your steadiness creates safety. And your calm becomes contagious in a way your fear once was. You begin attracting people who value depth, not distraction. Authenticity, not performance. Growth, not stagnation. You begin stepping into relationships where you are not responsible for carrying the emotional weight of others, but invited to share the experience of being human side by side. And in these relationships, you feel seen, not because you've simplified yourself, but because you've allowed yourself to remain whole. This is the quiet miracle of integration. You no longer chase belonging. You create it by honoring yourself. And then, almost without realizing it, you return to the paradox that opened your journey, the question that flickered at the edge of your awareness, like a whisper from some wiser version of you. Why does fear feel instinctive, while confidence feels earned? Now, standing at the end of this path, the answer arrives with a clarity so simple, it feels like truth remembering itself. Fear only feels instinctive because it was taught early, repeated often, and practiced unconsciously. Confidence is learned the same way through repetition, through practice, through choosing yourself again and again, even when doubt sits beside you like an old friend. Your mind, brilliant and loyal, reflects what you feed it. And now you know, you can choose the diet. You can choose the narrative. You can choose the patterns you want to strengthen. You can choose which voice inside you becomes the louder one. And with every choice, every boundary, every moment of presence, every breath of self-trust, confidence becomes less of a performance and more of a memory your body knows how to recall. So you stand here now, not at the end, but at the beginning of a deeper chapter, one where fear is no longer your master and confidence is no longer a mystery, one where you walk through life not trying to be invulnerable, but trying to be real. One where you let life shape you without letting it swallow you, let others inspire you without letting them define you, let the world move around you without losing your center. And in this place of integration, this soft, steady, earned place, you finally understand. Your mind learned fear the same way it learns confidence, and now you are the one teaching it.